having a panel discussion in which 3 banks and 3 knowledge partners will be invited. I request Shri Kamal Kishore, member NDMA, to kindly moderate the session and call the participants.
I hope the coffee was good and it was a good break. We've had a pretty intense 2 days, a lot of new things. At least I have learned a lot of new things. So it's now time to wrap up and see what comes after. You know, when we return to our offices, homes, we are asked, how was the workshop? And my usual answer is that I'll tell you in 6 months or maybe a year, because any workshop is as good as its follow-up. So this is an important session. You've done a lot of listening. I hope now you will do a lot of thinking and speaking. So from that perspective, we thought, some of us, there isn't any sort of specific scheme to how we've put these names here. We'll sit up front. Some of them have chaired the sessions earlier, made presentations and topics which have evoked a lot of interest. And then what I will do is I will make a very short intervention using a PowerPoint. It will be only 3 slides, capturing some of the emerging areas where we could perhaps work together, the content of, working together on the topic of disaster resilient infrastructure. And then we can have a chat. So maybe if everyone can be here, Michael, Eddie, Charlie Benson, Bina, Bilal, Professor Murthy. Did I miss anyone? So, I can say for myself that I learned a lot of new things. There wasn't a single session in which, my brain didn't have to be in overdrive to absorb half of what was being presented, because there was so much new stuff for me on the aspect of disaster resilient infrastructure. And a lot of things, it seems a lot of these areas are coming of age, and there is a lot of work happening in different pockets. We will benefit perhaps from working together on some of these, because these are areas of common interest. And when we work together, some of the parts is less than the whole. So the whole is more than the sum of the parts. So, what I did was over the last 2 days, I tried to classify things into what are some of the things that can be done at the policy level, what are some of the things that can be done in terms of knowledge generation, and what are the things that can be done at capacity level. So 3 different levels. And for each of these 3, what I'm going to sort of put before you is not by any means exhaustive. This is just indicative and areas where I thought we can do collaborative work. So it's not like, that X needs to happen, but you go home and do it. So of course you need to do that, but let's look at things that can be done together. So on the policy one, so policy, knowledge, capacity development. I think, in the run-up to this workshop, while engaging with a number of you experts, some present here, some participated by video, I think this phrase, system of systems of systems, or system of systems approach has been sort of ringing in my head for the last 2 days. I think we sometimes, in our common perception, tend to underestimate the complexity of the global system and how, knock-on effects of disasters can be really massive. So one area of work which could be potentially interesting is, you saw what Professor Jim Hall and then later Dr. Raghav Pant presented by video. Kamal, my namesake's presentation, also talked about it for the shipping sector. So maybe, rather than doing it in pockets, we could sort of see if there is value in doing a global analysis with sort of a sensible boundary around it in terms of the cascading effect, and look at how, where are the hot spots, where, if there are some effects on the infrastructure systems, the knock-on effects will be enormous. Should we begin to talk about the state of the world's infrastructure resilience? It's an open question. Maybe we can begin to do that for some nations at the national level. There are some countries that are already doing that. UK has an excellent national infrastructure assessment, which gives considerable space to issues of resilience, including the impact the climate change would have their system. So maybe there is something, a line of work that can be pursued there. So this is at the policy level, high level, work. But then, I remember yesterday afternoon, Michael was saying that, there is a lot of this high-end stuff at the international level and national level, and very quickly, capacities, knowledge, etc., goes into a different lower level at the national and subnational and local levels. So then we thought, let's look at what are the practical things that can be done which will actually, knowledge products which can actually begin to influence the way things are done. And Professor Bilal Ayoub's presentation yesterday and today, absolutely fascinating. The whole notion of manual of practice. In the agenda notes, when we were looking at risk assessments, one thing we said that again and again, that in the infrastructure systems, how do you design infrastructure for the future when you don't know what the future is likely to be? You know the direction of climate change, you don't know the extent of signal at the local level. And he presented, how we can sort of come up with the notion of adaptive design. And the manual of practice is a step before standards. At least for critical infrastructure, you begin to look at how do you do that. And in that, he highlighted one very nice example today of an elevated train track, which is designed in such a way that 50 years later, if you think that the sea level rise is going to be higher than it was expected, you can raise it. There are not many infrastructure systems that I know of that are adaptive like that. So can we catalog what are the practices like that? So that's one. Then the whole notion of resilience matrix. The agenda notes were framed to talk about assessing risk. And here we began to talk about assess resilience. The sort of more sort of, rather than sort of counterfactual, you look at, what is your resilience capacity. And similar work exists in other sectors. For energy efficiency, you have LEED, GRIHA in India. LEED has become GRIHA in India. So can we have some sort of a drawing on the work on resilience matrix? Can we begin to work on some key infrastructure, not everything? Maybe just take airports, maybe just take rail systems, and come up with some sort of a system of resilience certification. We can take a regional look on some of these issues and so on. So that whole thing of resilience matrix, coming up with the system, the way we measure energy efficiency, can we begin to measure resilience to a set of perils, and begin to see how it can be applied. And of course, one thing which came very clear was that risk assessment, if you do it just at the asset level, infrastructure asset level, it's not enough, because systems are interconnected, and it may be fine by itself, but it creates risks downstream. So how do we take territorial approach to it? There were very good examples from some of the presentations there. Then the presentation I made yesterday had some very interesting examples from around the world on traditional systems of infrastructure that have developed. So some colleagues after the presentation said that, well, we should begin to document that so that at least we don't degrade them. At least we keep what we already have. So that's one idea. Then on capacity, can we look at how some of the disaster control infrastructure, there were very good examples from some countries, Netherlands example, how do you do cost-benefit analysis, the work of the US Army Corps of Engineers, how do you do analysis for embankments, how do you decide how much money you need to spend on the embankment to achieve what level of resilience? Can we upgrade our systems in that direction? Then there was Professor Fabio Biondini's presentation, which talked about how do you look at life cycle considerations when you design infrastructure. And this is becoming more and more important now than ever before in human history. So how can we, can we develop some capacity to do that for some infrastructure classes? And of course, addressing Michael Ernst's concern, all are concerned, but he highlighted it, he reminded us, on building local capacity. How do you, people who manage infrastructure at the local level, at the reservoir level, what can we do to begin to upgrade their capacities? And of course, this morning, Professor Rajiv Shaw talked about how in Japan, as new infrastructure systems come into place, they begin to already develop standards for that, rather than it completely getting out of control and then deciding what the standards will be, what the regulatory environment will be. He gave the example of how they're trying to regulate or systematize drones, not just what can be done and what cannot be done, but also regulating the profession of drone people who fly drones. So that is very interesting. So how do you sort of set up in motion a process at the country level to begin to set standards in a more anticipatory way rather than in a more reactive way? So these are some of the thoughts we have. I think we can spend the next 30, 40 minutes hear from colleagues on the dais, but from all of you. None of them are going to make a long presentation. They're just here because I'm forcing them to say something, but I might do the same to you as well. So we will just start with maybe policy, have a little bit of discussion there, not spend the whole 30 minutes on that, and then we go from there. Some of them, most notably Dr. Michael Ernst, has a time constraint, so I will begin with him.
Okay, one clarification, Kamal. Are we going to, we'll do each sort of 3 rounds? Is that the idea, or? Yeah. Okay. Okay, thank you, and I would like to thank all of you, thank my hosts, certainly the NDMA and ISDR for inviting me to this workshop. It has been very, very interesting to talk with all of you, and also meet some old friends and have some conversations around this. This is a subject that I've been thinking about for quite some time in terms of the risk. I'm with the U.S. Agency for International Development, the Office of U.S. Foreign Disaster Assistance, and most of the work we do is responding or in helping countries respond internationally to disasters. And then we do a small amount of risk reduction. We focus always on the most vulnerable. So, and this is something that has come up in many of the conversations here, that the most vulnerable are often the ones that have the least capacity. They're the most disconnected and disenfranchised from much of the learning of really what even this room represents is probably what the top 1%, maybe less, in terms of wealth in the world. Most of the world is poor. Most of the world is quite vulnerable and limited in terms of information. Now, things are changing in a positive way, and they have over the past 17 years, but there's still a problem with getting that capacity to the local level. Now, in the interest of cutting things short, what I'd like to, in a way, put forth, because all of these things are important, the policy levels and what is done at the international, national, local, and intermediate government levels, as well as the local level, how it works together is all very important. And there isn't one thing. There are all sorts of things to learn, and that will work in different contexts. A lot of what we've talked about has been theoretical, and I'll have to admit that in public discourse there are certain things we can't talk about, which are disincentives there may be very personal incentives for different actors to not do what is in the best interest of risk reduction. And it's very difficult for us to talk about those because they may not follow legal norms, they may follow other norms, societal norms that we have to understand and overcome in terms of incentives. So I guess what I would cut to, in a way, is I think there's a lot to be learned and shared and attempted at the local level with all of the technology and some of the options that are available. And so what I would be interested in following up and see if there is any interest in is some sort of way to test some of these things more as a bottom-up piece, but making that linkage from some of the technology, the understanding, really put to test some of the theories that you're talking about in different contexts, and somehow sharing and spreading that information as we have successes. Because I'm a bit afraid that, at least over the past 20 years, as we've seen just tremendous growth in technology, in the ability to do different things and communicate, there is still a widening gap in wealth between the rich and the poor, and a widening gap in vulnerability as well. So we need to figure out a way to try to cut short that gap. I think there's been a lot of conversation about how can we, in a way, avoid this business as usual infrastructure growth, which looks totally unsustainable. It really has been unsustainable for the past 50 more years, for a new way. So, okay, I'll leave it there, but what I would like to propose in a way is there a way we can work together as a larger international group to try to test some of these hypotheses at the local level, see what works, share what works, and somehow motivate this, maybe with this idea of the Resilience Academy, getting university students that can somehow tap into the higher level research that's being done, but work with local governments, understand their constraints, and help them overcome it. And there's issues in finance, policy, all of this that at least that can be discussed, and maybe in the future, these people will grow and learn, and maybe the policymakers that will actually make some of these changes take place. We have a long road ahead, and I just would love to see, from all this learning, if we can get something to actually start moving on the ground that we'll all feel good about in another 20 years. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. There were some very useful reminders. The reminder of the widening gap between availability of technology and people without access to it, and so many other aspects of, so many other aspects that cut across the social economic spectrum. I think the point of having a bottom-up approach to sort of test some of these things before, getting all sort of excited about it is a good one. You sort of, in a very subtle manner, you challenged that, this is a lot of what we discussed was perhaps a bit theoretical, and the idea is how do we make it, work to actually change things on the ground. So I think, I will pose the challenge to, an academic and ask Bilal, because I think he presented the theory, and in my view, he also connected it to some of the practice. But can we really go all the way in practice? Is the theory there to influence the practice in a meaningful, scalable manner?
Thank you, Kamal. Kamal asked me to be reflective during the session, and the first thing came to mind in terms of reflective, that I'm happy that I came to this meeting. It's outstanding, and it's most interesting. Now, to answer your question, do we have the knowledge base and so on to address policy-related needs? I'll say that we are almost there. Still, there is room for additional developments at the methodological level, data collection, and so on. I prepared a list in here of items, and I didn't really separate them by policy, knowledge, and capacity levels. But then, while you're talking, I marked them by category, and I found that I have more in the knowledge category than in the others, which maybe reflects the way that what I do. Going to the policy end of things, I'll say one of the most important items is commitment at the country, local, and the institutional level. I mean, all of it really starts with commitment. And sometimes, although there might be talk about things, but the commitment, it could be lacking. And the way you could really measure commitment, at least in the United States, as well as I'm sure in other countries, is where the money. If there is no funding with an item, this means the commitment is lacking. I conducted a survey related to resilience of power distribution systems, and I found that the people, the users, are interested in a distribution system that's reliable, it can recover quickly, least disruption, and so on. You ask them how much you are willing to pay in terms of additional rate, and they will tell you none. So you'll wonder, do they mean it? Are they serious about this? So I think that commitment is essential. The other item is harmonization within and across those levels, meaning within at the country level, local and institutions. Let me give you an example. Recently, I received this request from a different committee of the American Society of Civil Engineers, and the question that was posed to me, that after a disaster, after an event, I'm not sure which event, but after an event, there was an observation that buildings that were LED rated, sustainable and so on, they experienced more damage than buildings that are non-LEED, right? So now here, this is lack of harmonization, right? We made it sustainable, but not resilient, right? So that we had debate in terms of what's the relationship between resilience and sustainability. So I think as we come up with policies, there is a need for considering things in terms of harmony, that everything is considered in its holistic form. So that's what I have about policy, and I'll hold on the other items for later on.
I think the point you raised about commitment, and commitment is reflected in where you put your money. And the point that harmonization, we work on resilience, there are some other people who work on energy efficiency, there are some other people who work on, friendly spaces, inclusive spaces, how all of these sort of policy imperatives, policy objectives are harmonized to achieve a sum total of optimal result for the people we seek to serve. So maybe any of the banks on my either side want to touch this, because you don't deal with just resilience, you work in all sectors. So how do you seek that harmonization? And within that process of harmonization, where is the room for making resilience, particularly infrastructure space, a priority?
Okay. Thank you, Kamal. On one level, a tricky question, but as it happens, ADB is currently drafting its new long-term strategy through to Strategy 2030, and resilience is one of the buzzwords that may actually feature in the sort of ADB's new tagline. So in a sense, ADB is already talking about resilience and recognizing that resilience is disaster resilience, climate resilience, urban resilience. There are many aspects of resilience that it will be looking to address together as well as individually. So there's some sort of institutional interest, I could say, in taking that forward. I think in a reflective mode, just to take a step back before I talk about policy, obviously, this is not the first attempt at a global initiative. We might be the first in this specific area, but there have been other global initiatives around other issues. I know you've been thinking about this for long term, many people involved, and there has no doubt been a lot of analysis undertaken, but I wonder whether it would be useful to take a step back and look at some of the other relevant initiatives, for instance, the Safe Schools Initiative, to see what that tried to achieve. Maybe it's still achieving. I haven't heard anything about it for ages. I couldn't even tell you if it's still alive. But to understand what progress has been made under other initiatives, why outcomes haven't necessarily been as good as was hoped, and to see what we can draw from that experience to better understand how we position ourselves, particularly in the balance of knowledge versus policy versus capacity. In policy, I think it's very important to have a policy angle, but in taking that forward, I think we also need to think very carefully about who the audience is, who's going to pick up this policy and implement it, at what level are we targeting it. This will shape the scope, the approach. I think we need to know before we begin where we want to come out and sort of work backwards a little bit.
Thank you, Charlie. I think that's a good reminder that maybe we should also look at similar initiatives in other areas, and before we sort of talk about the specific areas of work, we actually begin to look at the objectives of that policy work. What policy changes is it about to bring, at the national, subnational levels? Are they your reflections?
Look, Kamal, let me pick up on your slide and with the following question in mind, which is, if this global resilient infrastructure initiative is going to have, is going to be useful and practical and have early on changes in different countries. I like the idea of the National Resilient Infrastructure Reports, but I'll go a step further. And I'll add the question on policy and institutions. And instead of just having a report, what we have seen in other areas of engagement is to be able to have a practical methodology that allows countries to self-assess where are they in their journey towards a comprehensive policy and institutional arrangement that allows them, not only at the central level, but also at the subnational level and in the line agencies, in their interaction with civil society, to be more resilient, okay? And so that process of self-assessment, which was built, of course, in the Sendai framework and a lot of the work that has been done, but a self-reflection process that allows countries to say, look, how much overlap between responsibilities between institutions do we have? Is there clarity and roles and responsibilities between the national and the local government? Are there policies to mainstream resilience in the transport sector, in the power sector, in the housing sector? And then complement that with a peer review process that allows countries to help each other on an independent evaluation of the self-assessment, saying, look, this is where I think, I don't know, Kenya is, but I'd love to have India take a look at our self-assessment and start comparing and sharing lessons into this process. Because then it becomes a lot more proactive, just having consultants write an infrastructure report and having a process by which there's a reflection by those who are in charge of those policies and institutions to move into that direction. And it builds the sense of coalition where I help you, somebody else will help me, and then this triage begins to have a sense of ownership by all members. So it builds on these ideas, but it puts, it goes a step forward towards a lot more clear identification of actions where here we are in point, I've achieved 4 out of 10, and therefore in order for me to move to stage 4 to 5 and 6, these are the policy and institutional reforms that we want to move forward.
Thank you, Ade. I think to summarize what you're saying is that don't focus on the product of a report, but the process which will help generate knowledge and build capacity to look at resilience at the national, subnational levels. That would be a nice segue into the next bit on knowledge. But before that, I'll ask Bina to say a few words. She's good at producing global reports.
Yes, I would like to pick up very precisely on that point of process and purpose, really, rather than product, because I do like the idea of having a global assessment that's now based less on deterministic and current scenario assessments, but really on a probabilistic and forward-looking assessment of global risk, but then identifying hotspots, because that would really allow us then also to go back to what was discussed here yesterday and also to some extent today in terms of who owns the risk and who's responsible, because in a globalized system and a globalized economy, it's very often hard to then pinpoint responsibility when you have interconnected systems of not just infrastructure asset classes, but then also the whole network that comes with that. And similarly at the national level, really to look at, in a sense, less reports maybe, but really national level assessments to do to some extent the same thing, to really what was also mentioned here, to really address the whole notion of contingent liability, but then at the policy level, what would it mean to allow or to actually, in a sense, encourage contingent liability for national governments, but also for other actors in the game to actually be taken on board, and the hidden risks that are there and costs to come onto the balance sheets.
Thank you very much, Bina. I think we should move on to the knowledge bit. I think I can conclude the policy bit with Sure.
Maybe I'll say it differently. It was said that we could work towards developing this national resilient infrastructure reports. I'm looking at it this way, that as we are learning the process of this whole approach of systems approach, I see that in the early days, we will have to work on a qualitative platform, and then eventually, as we learn the relationships between the various parameters that influence, turn into a quantitative approach. So I look at this iterative system. As we put in more and more qualitative relationships, possibly we'll improve our network of the relations, interrelations. And as we also go down to the grassroots level and bring it down from bottom level, we'll also know the impact and quantify the impact to a larger extent. So it would be also a learning process for all the stakeholders involved in policy development. So this will help engage everybody, and it will also have reasonable amount of time, and we can keep this draft going from version 1 to a higher level to get more people understanding how to assess the resilience of infrastructure. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Murthy. So a good case for an iterative approach. Start with what you can do qualitatively before quantifying it. The reminder that, you know, focus on the process, focus on what it achieves rather than on the product and in itself. With that, maybe we can move into knowledge generation. And on the dais, we've got two professors. You know, we can have a toss of coin who wants to speak first.
All right, on the knowledge front, I have few items in here. Kamal mentioned the manual of practice that I covered during my presentation. I could see tremendous value in having a regional manual of practice since the hazards and the scope, the asset categories might be different. So that, you know, that's the first item that I suggest in here as for way forward. The second item is data collection, standardization, and so on. Relating to disasters, damages. There is some of that effort is ongoing, but I could see there might be some need to standardize it so that the experiences could be shared across countries within the region. The third item is the economics of resilience. I mean, this is more of benefit cost analysis. I think there is value to provide guidance and standardization to it. I know that's the way it's done in the US. We have a separate document that was prepared by the Department of Commerce. I was involved in reviewing some aspects of it, and it deals with that subject. The next item I have is performance standards. What does that mean? It's basically at the very end, we're after resilient and sustainable communities. So the very end is really the community. The infrastructure is there to provide services to the community. So the question that poses itself in here is, what are the performance requirements that I need for the infrastructure in order to meet target performance at the community level? So there is a need for defining those performance levels. Again, we have limited resources and should be driven towards meeting certain target levels. At the present, there is ongoing effort by ASC to prepare such a document on performance standards. The last item I have is about financing. I'm not planning to go over the session that we had on finance. The only item I'll add is creating some form of incentive structure to affect behavior, whether it's related to policy, decision-making, and so on, to encourage investments early on in such projects and infrastructure.
Thank you, Bilal. I will not try to summarize that, Professor.
Yeah. I look at this entire set, policy, knowledge, and capacity, and feel that as a group we can make significant progress if we can just start working with knowledge. And the items presented here tell us that it's a significant amount of information may be available, even though at research level, and in some cases documented through various multilateral agencies. It should be possible for us to make significant progress and get the broad understanding of resilience, how resilience is understood, measured, how it impacts, and how it can be entered into quantitative risk assessment, and share it with the broader audience worldwide, so that they can also build contextually similar documents which are relevant to their local areas. And I would pray that this should become one of our high priority items to get started on quickly, because it doesn't involve the whole set of stakeholders, but initially only the primary set of stakeholders. And that's why the gains will be much higher to begin with.
So, Michael, would that begin to address the concern of, local level, if we generated knowledge which actually meets specific needs rather than delving deep into theoretical constructs?
Well, I'll tell you. In fact, I have colleagues that are working with Professor Ayub, same that I went to graduate school with. So I have an academic background in engineering, and I understand how it's taught and the constraint sets that are presented and the theories that evolve. In the practice, when you run into the contextual aspects that are not part of any formal theory, and you're dealing with humans that have different incentives and different understandings, that's when it becomes an interesting struggle. And so that's not, it's completely understandable, but I must say that I don't think it's a matter of a shortage of knowledge. Sure, we're learning all the time, and that's great. That's exactly what we should be doing as humans. But in the application of it is where we run into some fascinating areas. I'm an engineer, and to me, the issue are what are the constraints that set up the solution? And different countries have different constraints, different communities have different constraints, and they have different capacities where you can take advantage of it. I guess what I would, in a way, like to shift that is, I think what we could really learn a lot from now is not so much from a lot of the theoretical constructs, but from actually, getting our hands dirty. And that's where there's a tremendous opportunity. One of the things, and some of us have talked about it, infrastructure will put 90% of the population, maybe 95% of the population asleep. It's not something that people think about intellectual. Services are what people need, and they're fairly concerned about whether they get water, all of these pieces. Now, disasters are actually something that is also, it's very visceral. There are movies about it. It's something that people get their heads around, and it can bring out the best of societies. People understand. It can motivate. What I can envision, I think, in this is how can we bring some of this thinking, and I've seen it in universities in developing countries, is a bit of a passion coming out to understand DRR. DRR is very topical, and it's also, for many people in countries that experience disasters, it can make a strong impression, especially on students. They can become very motivated. What I would sort of propose is there a way, to tap these students to help solve real problems for government, and the whole messy real problem that exists for a government, which is the urban planning, the environment, we've talked about it, the climate change, their infrastructure, all of that is what's what they need to solve, and how can we help bring in people and really look at what's behind it. A lot of what Charlotte said in terms of we need to understand what is blocking it, and these students could be part of that process, and if we could come up with a structure to link some of these academic pieces, the idea of a manual, I think is a very good one. Take that out. Would it work? What's preventing the application of some sort of standard approach to flexible design? What are the constraints? And really work that out and be able to share that information. Now I wish I don't feel like I have the solution, but is there a way we can try to have a little bit more of that, what I'm trying to say, a little bit more of that real experience in communities and figure out what captures the imagination, what motivates different communities, what are factors that may work against some of these pieces, and how can we come up with a situation where the communities themselves are able to tap the knowledge they need. And I guess part of me, in keeping with like Amartya Sen's development is freedom, the idea is these communities have to understand that resilience is also part of their freedom. How can we support that? Because it can't be the responsibility of academia, of the government at the national level. It has to be the communities and the local government's responsibility. How do we facilitate that with all of the capacity that we have to bear? So that's sort of where I would like to let me leave it there. And I think there is tremendous potential, but the barriers are still there in terms of in a way, the different silos we work in, whether they're academic or government or others. How do we break this barrier and again see real gains at that local level so that they can actually consume some of the intellectual products that are produced? Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. I think, whenever those of us who work in this area, whenever we are stuck, we like to produce a knowledge product. We like to write case studies. And they, I have seen stacks of them, stacked under a staircase. So I think the reminder that the application is a bigger challenge. So I would turn it around as what is the knowledge to apply the knowledge. Why some things work, they get taken up, why other things don't get taken up, what are the barriers to those? I think that's an important one. I mean, we can come up with very important, very good guidance on how to do adaptive design of infrastructure systems, but if nobody applies it, that knowledge is not really going to take us very far. So I'm not assuming that all the knowledge is here on this dais, so I think for a few minutes maybe we can hear from you who are a little bit farther away from here, from the mic, if you have any reflections on what we've discussed so far before we go forward. Yes, oh, that's a bye-bye actually. Sorry? Was there anyone? No. Okay. Yes, Christoph.
So, Christoph Pusch from the World Bank. Maybe just another dimension. I think the problem is always you cannot just find one way of approaching something. I mean, there's so many obstacles. On the other side, there's so many opportunities. When I try to think about, what problem do we try to fix? I mean, we see a lot of kind of damages of infrastructure to disasters, and that's already happening, and then we're having an additional layer of complexity through the kind of climate change and adaptations, so that even more kind of it requires kind of a probabilistic approach to think about this. But then when I go to a more level of simplicity, I think we are seeing already a lot of damages now, and I think Deepak was presenting the housing reconstruction program. When we had a situation like in Nepal, you can travel throughout the countries, you look at all the buildings, and you know they will not withstand kind of earthquake risks. So for that kind of class of problems, it's not so much kind of determining probabilistic models, new standards, whatever. There is kind of like a common sense approach, more what Michael is saying. The challenge is what kind of incentive, what kind of mechanism can you put in place to move this to the next level of construction quality that kind of is acceptable. So then that's kind of one class, and I would say that in many developing countries we're having problems even to apply current standards to the element. Then we're having the issues of about maintenance operations. I think there are studies done by our transport sector colleagues. There's a global initiative just saying, we have a deteriorating kind of infrastructure because of the lack of operation maintenance. We're having programs in other countries where we are kind of putting millions of kind of shelter kind of investments in, and we have a hard time to convince also the government that this needs to be maintained and operated. So there's an element which can be easily already fixed, also resilience. And then there's kind of a more kind of sophisticated, kind of large scale kind of infrastructure, and this is also maybe finance in the future more from the private sector. There we have to think about simple mechanisms, like we're already applying in the World Bank, of risk screening based on risk assessment, risk information, incorporating this in this element. And then in parallel, there's the kind of the agenda of always updating standards and moving forward. So my recommendation would be to look at different avenues of engagement, identifying also low-hanging fruits and trying to move this on a kind of a parallel track. And because I think there's a lot of problems there out, which I think they're quite kind of manageable to fix with a lot of efforts, and there's some problems which are kind of more challenging. So that is just a recommendation how to frame this initiative, that we are looking more, rather than going deeper understanding the problem, trying more avenues of solutions to a certain set of problems. Maybe that kind of could complement the thinking what you're presenting here. I'm not saying that this is the wrong way, it's just I think these are elements of that, and if we could complement this with very kind of practical, solution-oriented approaches.
Thank you, Christoph. Andrew.
Yeah, thanks, Kamal. Yeah, I think, I mean, for this to work, it needs to work on different levels simultaneously. I don't think reports by themselves automatically change anything or do anything practical, but I think they're not supposed to be necessarily practical products. But I think if you have a sort of a series of reports that come out fairly systematically over a period of time, it is actually possible to, in a sense, shape the way people start thinking about the problem. And that's almost the first thing we actually need to do, is actually shape the sort of conceptual framework or the sort of way people even imagine the problem. And I think part of what we have at the moment is we're not capable of actually imagining how the whole thing could look like and how it could change. So I see the sort of reports, whether it's global or national, being more part of that. I mean, some people might call it advocacy. It's not a word I like, because we're not necessarily advocating anything, but I think it's really a way of just sort of building a common framing, understanding, in Spanish you would say imaginario, of the problem, which currently we have bits, each of us have bits of this, but we need to, in a sense, create that sort of common understanding. And then, I mean, some of the other things you showed there, the issue of the potential for certification, or creating a resilient infrastructure asset class, those I think are sort of incentives for changing behavior. I mean, it's like finding the sort of, pressure points in acupuncture where you can actually make just a small change and actually produce a systemic change. Now, we can't alone, change the system, but if we can find ways of, in a sense, diverting flows of capital, or flows of behavior in different ways by just small changes, I think these are things we could look at doing. And I think the third area, which really connects with sort of what Michael's saying, is be sort of opportunistic for looking at opportunities in practice to change the system, whether that's through, development of particular standards, technical assistance projects, intervening in particular sectors where there's opportunities with governments, with the banks, and with other partners. And I think we should do this again in a fairly, opportunistic way in the good sense, not in the sort of bad sense of the word opportunistic, because I think to try and pretend we can sort of change the whole system, as I said yesterday, I think it's a sort of chimeric idea. I prefer a sort of like guerrilla warfare approach, where we're actually able to sort of have a number of small victories around, which gradually together start sort of changing the system. So I think if we can think of structuring this on sort of those different levels, then it would be possible to bring about a change. Just one final thing, is no one's discussed about the time frame of this thing. But change is not going to happen on this in 1 or 2 years. I think we need to even be sort of, it's a mixture of ambitious and realism, but I think we need to be thinking about this sort of on a 10-year time frame to really make a difference.
Thank you, Christoph and Andrew. I think those were two very interesting, very important comments. Different levels of opportunity. There are aspects of building resilience that do not require fresh knowledge. They do not require probabilistic assessment of risk at a household level, and that can be done. That's a pretty straightforward thing. And my counterpoint to that is that the whole idea of focusing on infrastructure was to be strategic. In I believe it was in Andrew's presentation, he invoked Pareto principle, saying that 70% of the risk is in 30% of the assets or geographic area or whatever. So the focus on infrastructure is meant to be strategic, rather than you could focus on housing, but then you're dealing with a completely different order of magnitude of stakeholders in it. Andrew's point on, you be opportunistic, you do report by all means, but recognize its limitation, and create incentives for behavioral change. Very good points. And I think the way the outcome, or not really outcome, but the reflections on the slides are framed, they are in that order only. So, as you go from the 1 to 3, more practical things. Bilal wants to say something.
No, I think from Michael to Christoph to Andrew, we are covering it from different aspects. I could see, if I want to frame it in a holistic sense, I could say there are asset classes, there are basically users of best practices or the manuals we are talking about, what's the level of skill and so on. And second, the beneficiaries, who are basically the users of the infrastructure. This could be some variations in terms of needs. And the fourth one is the resources available. This could determine what type of solutions that we should pursue. Now, if you take those 4 items and do Cartesian product for them, all the possible combinations, you'll find that we have to use different tools. If the asset is expensive, it's long life, long term for it, and the users is extensive use, such as maybe a metro system and so on, it does warrant more sophisticated analysis. If it is housing and so on, resources are limited, it might be just rules of thumb type of practices. And this could be done by experience and based on available local resources.
Thank you. Maybe we should now move on to more practical things and the issue of capacity.
But if I may, just one point, and I think that knowledge is very good, but I continue to be very worried about the low availability of data to do all of these analyses. Hydrometeorological systems around the world are in a dismal state of array for a large majority of the countries. Information on earthquake risk is really, really low, and therefore, at all points, if we were going to apply a manual practice, if we don't have enough data, then you're always limping. And it's such a difficult public good that I think a priority for countries to start building the level of information, and as the only way to understand, to reduce the level of deep uncertainty is to have as much data. You may never fix the uncertainty, but if we continue with this level of data coverage, it's not going to get us closer to the solution, and not only collection of data, but also processing in a way that all stakeholders are able to use it. So it's not only engineers, but the communities and the households, the insurance companies, all the stakeholders of society. So I think that an important part of the knowledge side is going to be the data collection systems in all these dimensions of risks.
Thanks. I just wanted to endorse my support for something around incentives. We did some work a few years ago around incentives and realised it's really very, very little literature on incentives, whether you're talking about incentives for households, for business, for government, to both invest in resilience but also to comply with building codes and so on. I think it's a huge hole in the literature. There are manuals, I know we can have more manuals, but there are manuals out there, and each manual is written with a particular audience in mind and doesn't necessarily translate across countries. Likewise, obviously, incentives don't translate across countries, but just some generic piece that brings together good practice, good examples, puts ideas out there, because a lot of imagination is sometimes needed to come up with practical incentives that really work. I also just wanted to put in a word of caution on the resilience certification. where it leads obviously directly through to practical application, which is great, but I think we need to look very carefully at quite what it is that practical implication is. So in this case where it's proposed that perhaps companies that participate in public tenders would need that certification, what is then the implication for small business that can't afford the certification process? So we need to sort of follow through the implications.
Yeah. Absolutely. We can't get very enthusiastic about it and then without anticipating the full consequences of following that up. So maybe we can move on to some practical stuff on capacity. Maybe if you can have the next slide, can you move slide from there? Thank you, thank you. So, Professor Moti, would you like to take that on?
I'd like to take a lead from what Professor Ila Patnaik said this afternoon, that we're going to build a large amount of infrastructure in this country. And if I can just estimate what is the outlay, and then say how many people are required at the level of workers, artisans, technicians, and then engineers, architects, and so on. If I can estimate that and then see whether the nation indeed has those and how long it will take for us to build those hands. I think we can do that calculation, backward calculation, we'd do a quick estimate of what infrastructure is required, and then estimate in each track, in each vertical of the infrastructure, how many people are required. Do we have that? If not, time has come for us to embark on a major program in all the technical institutes in the country to prepare these hands so that this infrastructure can be built. Thank you.
The simple issue of scale, we are not even talking about very high end of sophistication. I think that is a big challenge. Anyone else wants to comment on Bina?
Yeah, I'd like to link it actually back to so the knowledge and capacity development in one, and picking up from your point on the dearth of data, which obviously is a key issue and continues to be one, but at the same time it could be a low-hanging fruit, because taking infrastructure as an entry point into what is already happening in terms of the increased need now that is recognized by countries, but also by companies, by communities, by different sets of actors in the context of sustainable development, in the context of just becoming more competitive, to actually have solid sets of data at all levels. And in the context of potentially also loss accounting, systematic loss accounting done by governments, one really practical and immediate step could be also, as part of capacity development, is to just identify a number of other indicators, in a sense, and metrics that would be collected systematically in terms of, because currently, for example, in existing national loss databases, it's mainly, has a water supply system been damaged, yes or no, destroyed, yes or no, and that's it. But to have a few more detailed indicators around that, but then also involve, and that's where the capacity building comes in, but also the engagement of those affected, involve, for example, the business community, the small and medium enterprises, in identifying which indicators are those. Because, for example, when we did studies in 2013, I think it was, of small and medium enterprises, more than 1,000 in the US, and looking at what were really the key, not just perceptions, but the key concerns in terms of follow-on impacts from disasters and impact on specific infrastructure and assets. It was mainly electricity blackout, basically. So just to look also at how could one, on the data side, but then use that for early warning, ultimately. How can one then identify those particular, in a sense, pressure points and hotspots for those medium and sized enterprises that ultimately are at the, to some extent, at the end of the supply chain that we're talking about when we're talking about globalized economies. So kind of applying that in a very practical manner at the local level, but also at the national level, would allow us to actually, I think, strategically get to also a better global picture of where we're going with the risk.
Thank you very much, Veena. That was a very good point, how we can use some of the existing work and enhance that and see how we need to collect data on some additional indicators to look at what is happening to infrastructure sectors, for example, and use that as a process to build awareness and also capacity. I just wanted to say we have about 10 more minutes left, or even less, before the closing ceremony starts. The vice chairman of our our planning commission, our ministers are on their way, so we will try to wrap it up very quickly. We can have a word from Bilal, and then some closing reflections from everyone, and then we close this.
I have one comment, or a couple of comments related to capacity building. The first one focuses on human resources. I think in order to make a change, we need to empower the people in various countries and regions. There is a need for transferring the knowledge and enhancing the level of ownership in what's being developed. I think there is a need to inspire individuals, identify leaders and develop them, and basically they will be fully empowered to deal with it within the country. Whether it's a manual of practice, they are the most familiar with what needs to be done, most familiar with the limitations and the constraints. Ideally, we need to train, as the phrase goes, we need to train the trainers. In a project that we did for the Army Corps of Engineers, there was an interest in inspection of dams. And we developed a methodology, but we don't have the capacity, the contractors at the time, to actually deal with the thousands of bridges that they have to be dealt with. So we held a workshop to train the leaders within the Corps to deal with that issue. So that's how we were able to spread the knowledge and in a very effective way. The last item I have is about capacity building, is finding the funding for all the other items that we mentioned, whether it's training and so on. These are not funding to projects, but funding actually to implement, whether it's regional manual of practice and training and empowerment and leadership and so on. Thank you.
So thank you very much. I think we'll just begin to wrap this up. This is meant to be a reflective session. This is not a concluding session. Dr. Thiru is going to provide a closure to this in the closing ceremony, a summary of this thing. So I will start with Professor Murthy, some final reflections, 1 or 2 minutes each, and then we wrap up.
Thank you. At the end of 2 days on a subject which is relatively new to all of us, in the way it is presented from the point of view of resilience, I thought that if building resilient infrastructure across the world should be made sustainable, then each nation should have all the 3 things that we have today in the afternoon's discussion, which is capacity, education, and policy. Clearly, the context of each nation may be significantly different, and so they will have to learn from the existing practices of resilient infrastructure development and create their own version of policy, knowledge systems, as well as capacity needed to address that. Thank you once again for all the learning in the last 2 days. Thank you.
Thank you. So very briefly, I think also it's been an extremely useful few days. I think we've determined a very strong rationale for continuing to take this initiative forward, and I think there's huge consensus in the room that this is just the beginning of a very big initiative. ADB is certainly very interested in continuing to engage on this and to be involved going forward. I think it's going to be very important to find practical ways, though, that it doesn't just become yet another talk shop, that I don't find myself every 6 months writing a PowerPoint presentation for a VP to turn up at this event and then I get no feedback for the next 6 months till I write the next PowerPoint presentation. You know, I think we need to make sure it's a really live initiative with very practical outputs that actually resonate with many countries and take us forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Kamal. Yeah, I would just follow on from those 2 points you made. Really, the initiative, I think, is excellent, and I've had really a number of extremely interesting conversations with a range of partners. You've managed to bring into this room really quite an august participation, but also really a select number of institutions that I've realized were not otherwise actually part of the discussion previously. So the leadership is really to be commended, and that brings me to my second point. I'd hope, and I think we would all hope, that the leadership of the Indian government, but also some of the other partners who really put strong propositions forward, will continue. And ideally, I think maybe potentially if we could just start applying pilots, guerrilla style maybe, in 2 countries, 1 Indian state, and really look at how we can actually aim for very concrete results, which would also address the incentive issue. So for example, really what would it look like to design a bankable, adaptive, resilient infrastructure project? that would allow also then the government to go and to the funders that are out there looking for projects.
My colleagues covered it fully, and I totally concur with them. And all I'd like to add is congratulations to the organizers, and I'm delighted to be part of it. Thank you so much.
Look, look, fantastic step moving forward. I think that, that there's much to be done in the initiative, and you can count on us from the World Bank Group. The practicality of the next steps and the vision is going to be an important part of the process as we move forward. There's much going on in the resilience steps, because it's something that countries are beginning to feel that that it's an important part of development. This initiative, I think, is a spark at the right moment if it is able to catalyze that level of energy. And I think that thanks to the leadership of the government of India, it has all the elements for success. So count on us on that support.
Thank you very much, everybody. I think it was a challenging session. Your reflections on reflections that I presented were well taken note of. We have to continue this. If this session had ended in a very sort of neat, clearly packaged outcome that these are the 5 things we need to do and the world's problems of resilient infrastructure will be solved, I would be very worried. I think it's good that we sort of unpacked a little bit more the complexity of the task before us. And also, I think the one key takeaway for me from this reflection is that whatever we do next has to have a very practical dimension. Yes, to do practical stuff, you need knowledge, you need policy, but we cannot wait for a very long time to just keep generating policy documents and knowledge products without actually making a difference on the ground. So the effort really should be on really connecting it as soon as possible to making changes. And there are indeed low-hanging fruits which we can pluck, where changes can be made in a relatively short time frame, with the reminder that Andrew put forward that don't think of a 6-month time frame, but look at it really on a decadal time scale. With that, I would like to thank you thank my panelists for some challenging conversation, some interesting reflections. We close here. I would urge you to stay in the room. We will start with the next session, which will be the last session of the day any moment. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for moderating the panel discussion. We now move to the closing ceremony of this 2-day international workshop on DRI. Chief guests of the function, Dr. Rajiv Kumar, Vice Chairman, National Institute for Transforming India, and Honorable Minister of State for Home Affairs, Shri Kiren Rijiju, are due to arrive shortly. I request you everyone to kindly be seated, please.